Welcome to Eyes Open, Hands Up, where you will learn about strategies to support deaf and hard of hearing children's language acquisition. We would like to recognize the individuals behind this project: Beverly Buchanan, Ashley Green Woods, Dr. M. Diane Clark, and Megan Youngs. Eyes Open, Hands Up is a three-part video. We cover 3 different areas related to language acquisition in deaf and hard of hearing children. The first topic is how language develops in deaf and hard of hearing children and what parents or professionals need to know in order to support typical language development. The second topic is the critical period, what it is and why it is important. The third and final topic in this series is language. What is language, and how do we best support the development of language? We will begin with discussing how language develops in deaf and hard of hearing children, whether the process of language acquisition is different for deaf children, and what parents and professionals need to know in order to support typical language development. We will begin with a video of what to pay attention to in language development. Isla is a deaf baby with hearing parents. Here, we see her using manual babbling in response to the person behind the camera. Let's see that again. Notice the hand movements use the same hand shape and repetitive patterns? That's exactly what manual babbling looks like. Over time, manual babbling becomes more complex, and the hand shapes that the child uses most frequently will lead to their first signs. Here, you can see Isla again in the second video. At this stage in her language development, Isla can recognize simple words with pictures and use the corresponding sign for each picture. Isla has parents who have made sure she has had full access to a visual language, and as we can see, she is demonstrating typical language development. The brain has certain parts that are responsible for different things. For instance, there are 2 areas in the brain, the Broca and Wernicke areas, that have a big role in language. Broca's area is where expressive language takes shape, and Wernicke's area is where receptive language is handled. We could be here all day discussing the different areas of the brain and how they affect language, but the primary thing to understand is that the brain is constantly working, constantly creating new synapses, and constantly taking information from what we see and hear and categorizing them in the appropriate places. Now that we know a little bit more about how the brain works, you may be asking what happens in the brains of deaf and hard of hearing children when language develops. The auditory and visual cortex collaborate to produce language. In fact, 80 to 90% of sensory information enters the brain through the eyes. Regardless of your child's hearing status, any form of communication, whether it be spoken or visual, will rely on visual cues to access effective communication. Visual cues do not always mean sign language. Visual cues also cover nonverbal communication, such as facial expressions to gauge if the speaker is happy or angry, eye gaze to see what item the speaker is talking about, or the use of hands during speaking to place an emphasis on the speaker's message. A researcher named Karen Emery discovered that the brain reacts to actual signs that resemble a gesture, such as the sign for drink, in exactly the same way as if it hears the word drink, which suggests that the brain is organized for language, not for speech. Eyes Open, Hands Up wants to emphasize that regardless of the child's hearing status, visual language is fully accessible for all children. The increased reliance on visual information in the brain by deaf and hard of hearing children requires alternative strategies to stimulate language development, such as developing eye gaze, pointing, gesturing, physical touch, and attention-getting behaviors. The earlier a child gets full access to a comprehensible language, the better the chances of typical language development the child has. As we saw earlier in Eyes Open, Hands Up, earlier acquisition of language leads to more activation in the brain. First, we look at what happens in a brain that has had typical access to language. This video on the right shows a brain that has developed typically with full access to a comprehensible language, and its synapses are functioning typically. Here, you can see how quickly the synapses are firing. Now, in this video, we see a brain that has had a delayed and diminished access to language. Here, you can see that the synapses are slower to activate. What happens if my deaf or hard of hearing child has not had access to a language at an early age? Up until now, we have discussed typical access. Sometimes access to language does not happen until later. What happens in the brain if there is late access to language? A prolonged, diminished access to a fully accessible language has been shown to result in delays, ranging from mild to severe. The longer a brain goes without an accessible language, the more severe the impact is. Each year that passes without an accessible language leads to permanent changes in the neurological structure of the brain that cannot be reversed. The critical period. What is the critical period, and why is it important? The critical period for language acquisition is the belief that language is acquired best during the first few months of a child's life and becomes more difficult to learn at older ages. The first few months of your child's life is very important for language acquisition. Past this time, it is much more difficult for a child to acquire language, and their language acquisition will not be typical. As every parent knows, babies begin their language acquisition by babbling. All babies, regardless of their hearing status, babble using two modalities: verbally and manually. Watch this video to see how this deaf baby is communicating through manual babbling with his father. Typically, between 10 to 11 months is when babbling stops. Around 10 to 11 months is also an important time in the critical period, as this is when the perceptual window begins to shut. As you saw in the previous video, manual babbling involves using the hands to communicate. In 1991, researchers Petito and Marentet discovered that both deaf and hearing babies produce instances of manual babbling, and that it is not related to their hearing status. However, deaf babies' manual babbling becomes more complex over time, whereas hearing babies gradually drop the use of manual babbling. Petito and Marentet also found that deaf babies naturally display preferences in hand shape, location, and movement of their manual babbling, which frequently extends into their first signs. Here, we see how this young child has observed the environment around them and is using manual babbling to imitate a video call. While it may not seem so, babbling actually plays an important role in language acquisition. By babbling, babies are building to the development of early phonology. When parents or caregivers stimulate the babies by responding to their babbles, they are providing access to language and building the foundation for a strong language development. This time period is critical for the later production of signs or words. Here is a visual of how rapidly the perceptual window closes. Here, you see from birth to around 3, the quality of language acquisition is high. Past that time, it becomes more difficult to acquire language typically. This time period seems so short. There has been recent research that shows the use of both spoken and sign languages may keep the perceptual window open longer. The longer the perceptual window is open, the better it is for typical language acquisition. Now, we need to focus on what exactly language is. Language. What is language, and how do we best support the development of language? How does language work in the brain? There is research to show that the brain does not discriminate between languages if it receives access to a comprehensible language during the early years. This makes sense when you consider many children can learn multiple languages at an early age. Now, what if my child is deaf or hard of hearing? Does this mean my child's brain functions differently? Absolutely not. As long as language acquisition begins in infancy, there is no difference in deaf and hearing children's brains. Now that we know the brain does not discriminate between languages, is there a certain time where the brain must pick one language to use? How do I pick between a spoken language or a visual language for my child? Based on current research, Eyes Open, Hands Up believes that providing access to both languages is the most beneficial choice for your child. Data shows that children who are provided early access to both can successfully use both languages and choose the most appropriate one for themselves, depending on the environment. To reduce risks of language delay, provide access to everything to your child. Your child will acquire ASL and English at the same time. The important thing to remember with language acquisition is ACCESS. If a language is not accessible, it will not develop typically. A. Access and exposure. C. Closely monitored and consistent access from early infancy. C. Create connections and opportunities. E. Environment is conducive to language learning. S. Selected aspects of language considered at risk receive attention. S. Service provision is optimized.